Welcome to a Modern Nonprofit podcast, powered by the Charity CFO, your compass for creative solutions in running your nonprofit. I'm Tasha Anderson, your host and guide through this nonprofit maze. From fundraising to volunteer management, we've got your back. Join us each episode for fresh, game-changing strategies that can make a real impact. Hey, nonprofit friends, we're back for another episode of a Modern Nonprofit podcast. I'm Tasha Anderson, your host, and I'm a self-proclaimed data junkie. Anybody that's been listening knows I like numbers. I think it kind of goes with the territory. I'm a CPA in my day job after all. And today, I brought on a guest we're gonna talk about data. And Sawyer, you are a data expert. You focus on analytics, data management, especially working in the nonprofit space. So Sawyer, thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation as we kind of geek out on data and why it matters into the nonprofit space and how we can make better use of the data within our organizations. But before I dive in, Sawyer, thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to this conversation.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm excited about this. I love data probably about as much as you do, Tasha. And so it'd be fun to have two data nerds talking for a while. So I could do this all day. It's great.
Exactly. Maybe some people don't realize that I'm a data. I mean, they're like, oh, you're a numbers person. Of course you like data. But the reality is I'm a KPI junkie, and I wholeheartedly believe that what you measure, you pay attention to. And I think that's true for all businesses all the time. And it's certainly been true for me in my business. But data is a very relevant topic in the nonprofit space right now. Because, our funders want data, they want measurement, they want tracking, they want all of these things. And I don't think anybody can really completely argue with if they give you money, they want to see an outcome. Okay, we just have to lean into this a little bit more. And we have to, make sure that we're tracking and measuring these things. But I don't think data tracking is a completely new phenomenon to the nonprofit world. In fact, I worked with many nonprofit organizations that have an abundance of data, just a warehouse of data. And that's where it ends, right? They have a warehouse of data, and yet they don't either have the tools, the resources, the human capacity, whatever it might be, to actually make sense of that data and convert it into stories of like impact and measurement in a way that anybody can actually kind of understand it. So I know you probably see this in your world. Tell us what you're kind of seeing, or what you think the strategic role of data is within the nonprofit space, and especially as it relates to achieving their organizational goals.
Yeah, that's an interesting point about people collecting lots of data, because there was an era of kind of both the for-profit world and the nonprofit world, whatever, was just saying data is an asset, data is an asset. You want as much data as possible. And so we just started collecting stuff without any real thought about what we're doing with it.
Right. Or why.
It was labeled as an asset. And so I want as many assets as I can. But when you have data and you don't do anything with it, it's actually kind of a liability to you. It's a cost to store. It's a security risk. It's expensive to move or manage. And so if you're not actually getting any value out of it, like, let's get rid of that data, or like, let's figure out how to do something with it. So data by itself isn't valuable. Data that is purposeful and thoughtful and designed measurements with intention can be extremely valuable to an organization. But people stop at, I got lots of data, that's really valuable. No, data is valuable once it's starting to measure and function well within the organization to help it.
Completely agree with that. And so, these organizations have been collecting data for years and years and years, right? That's nothing new. I'm curious, do you have any examples of where you've seen nonprofits really drive innovation, or at least have a competitive advantage in their either operations or storytelling, because they've been able to leverage this data that, like I said, I think so many organizations collect mounds and mounds of data. But do you have any examples of where organizations have done a really good job of like collecting the data and actually translating to something that's meaningful?
Well, there's lots of small things and large examples. So a couple of small examples. There's ways that data helps us just in standard, like, operational things that we're running around the organization. So there's an organization here in Michigan, a camping organization, that sends buses to pick up kids every week, a couple hours away, pick up kids to bus them into camp. And for years, the standard was we send 5 buses to pick up kids, regardless of how many kids were actually ready to come. But through over the last year, as I was working with their organization, as we started to think about we started collecting data and actually paying attention to what was happening. We started to, now we have a simple script that can run that spits out, says, hey, this week when we leave, we only need 3 buses because we only have so many kids coming. And so that's saving 3 people on their staff the weekend of having to drive downstate to pick up kids. It's saving the cost and maintenance on the buses.
Okay.
Some really, really small little things like that. Like, hey, operationally, we're more efficient because we actually we're looking at data now to make a decision about what buses to bring.
Rather than by default. Yeah.
But yeah, it was like, this is where we've always done it. We haven't really evaluated what we're doing it, but data can now start to provide context around decisions. And that's one of the core purposes I see for data, is like, hey, data it serves a decision-making function within an organization.
Yes.
And so some people, especially I hang out with data people all the time, we talk about data-driven decisions. So it's like, hey, we're making decisions based on data. And then sometimes we just collect a lot of data, but I like to think about decision-driven data. And so we figure out what decisions we're trying to make or what decisions we need to make. And then we figure out where the data is and what information is going to help us and give us the context we need to make a better decision or more informed decision or more accurate decision.
I love that. I think I could probably relate, though, to a lot of the listeners that are probably listening to this. I tell people I love data. I'm a numbers person, but I'm actually, I think, a very intuitive kind of a gut feeling. I tend to be more of an emotional creature. Maybe blame it on the ENFP, like Myers-Briggs profile, or because I'm a Scorpio, or whatever you want to blame. But I'm an emotional person. But what I love data is it gives me a check and balance for like, I think this is the right thing. And if I can basically have a data story to either validate or not what my gut is telling me, I don't know. To me, it's a little bit of like a bumper bowling with with some of the decisions that I have to make. And I have a gut feeling. It's like, okay. And also the data would suggest we need to do this. But every organization is different with their level of like what you call data maturity, right?
Sure.
And some organizations create a lot or a little, and some make sense or no sense at all with the data. Help me understand what you mean by data maturity, and maybe talk about some of the models or frameworks for which an organization can decide where they're at with that.
Sure. So one simple kind of scale that I use when I'm just trying to describe data maturity is there's kind of like 4 levels to it. There's descriptive, diagnostic, predictive, or prescriptive. And this is kind of describes the types of questions that you're able to ask and able to answer with data. And so if you're at a less mature data state, then you're doing descriptive analytics or descriptive data work. And that means we're asking the question, what happened? And we're just getting descriptions about what's happening in an organization. How many people are showing up at our programs? What's revenue? What's our volunteer attendance? Things like that.
Sure.
Descriptive questions. The next phase that's a little bit more advanced, or a little more mature, would be diagnostic. And that's asking why it happened. Like we see there were bumps in attendance. We see that there were changes in revenue this quarter, or things like that. You can then begin to drill in and ask why questions, diagnostic questions about the data.
Okay.
Predictive is the next phase. That looks like, hey, we're forecasting out what's going to happen. We have a good idea of what's going to happen based on enough historical information and enough guess about the next steps. And then prescriptive is the final phase. By the most mature phase is prescriptive. So predictive, what's going to happen? Prescriptive, what are we going to do, or what should we do based on the data forecasting? So you can think about, if you're trying to figure out where your organization's at on in terms of our level of maturity, just think about what questions you are currently able to ask and are asking of your data when it comes to, I'm facing a decision about whether we should open a new site for our programs or our operations. Hey, are we able to ask questions about like what's happened? Why did it happen? What's going to happen, or what should we do? Like, where on that scale do we fall off in terms of our ability to answer questions with data? Maybe we get the descriptive right. Maybe we get a little bit of the why questions, diagnostic right, but we're nowhere. But I can't yet answer, prescriptive or predictive. So that's a little bit of a framework I use.
That's where I want to be. Predictive and prescriptive. That's what I need, right?
Yeah. And
no surprises. I want to see the future. And make decisions accordingly.
It's a foundation layering. Like, you can't do prescriptive analytics if you haven't first done any sort of like descriptive. Like, you build these kind of like layer by layer, both in terms of data literacy and just a data
Mm,
culture, but then also
mhm.
like technologically wise in terms of like, how are you storing the data? Do you have good tools, and do you have the skill sets to be able to manage and operate those different layers of maturity? And so you can't jump to one. It's kind of like you mature in building the foundations of the building.
I mean, it makes absolute sense. And, I get this question a lot with organizations or from organizations, what should we be measuring? And sometimes we have to measure what our funders tell us to measure, programmatic outcomes, for example. But then I often get the questions, what are the KPIs that we should be creating or that we should be tracking? And how do we compare with others or whatever it might be? I'm sure you get this question too. And when people ask you, as an organization, what should we measure? What should we track? What should we report on? What is your response to this loaded question?
Well, so this is one of the reasons I got into the nonprofit world more, because I
Mm,
enjoy thinking about the measurement questions of nonprofits more than I did the for-profit world. I did consulting in the
hmm.
for-profit world for a long time, and you're always measuring profit and revenue and
Sure.
costs and things like that. So when I got to the nonprofit world and we're measuring different sorts of outcomes, it got interesting. So I'm kind of a measurement junkie, and
Hmm.
uh, this might be a little controversial, but I think we measure too much and track too much in general.
Mm, hmm. Hmm.
So once you start measuring things in your organization, you have to be very cautious of the incentives that start to show up around those measurements. That's kind
Mm,
of warning number one. Like, you start measuring a lot of things,
mm,
people start looking at those measurements and start optimizing for measurements. So you have to be very careful about incentives. Sometimes you want people to be optimized for specific measurements, but oftentimes measurements come with some problematic incentives attached to them when you're
hmm.
tracking performance based on that measurement, or
Hmm.
when you're incentivizing people to optimize for it.
Yeah.
It also can just become quite a distraction. I think we've all seen dashboards, or can imagine a dashboard that has so many numbers or so many charts, graphs, gauges, etc. And there's just so much. It's like, hey, this is supposed to be an executive dashboard or an overview dashboard of everything.
Yeah.
And you look at it and you're like, I don't know what to do with this. There's lots
Right.
of information. There's nothing actionable or nothing purposeful about it. So back to maybe the original questions. What do you think about measuring? I start thinking about I try to strip it down to, we have a North Star metric. We know what our end goal is, and that's usually tied to what your mission is. There's something at
Hmm.
the very top, a terminal metric or a destination metric that you're tracking.
Hmm.
Access to affordable housing, child safety, some
Hmm.
sort of humanitarian need or educational outcomes, those types of things. You have some sort of like terminal outcome that you're going for. Track that. And then you want to track what I call waypoints, or like, hey, progress measures. Maybe you have two or three things that are the key markers that are going to tell you that you're getting closer. The terminal
Hmm.
metric doesn't always move quite as fast as you want it to, but there are other
Hmm.
things you can track along the way that are going to tell you getting close to that. This is
Hmm.
where people get really busy. I think you can come up with lots of metrics there.
Yeah.
You can
Yeah.
scale it down to two or three things. Like, these are the things that really we know move the needle. And then you have decision metrics, which are designed a little bit differently. Decision metrics are saying, when X happens, we will do Y. And like,
Hmm.
you kind of bake into it a defined decision point, instead of it being a chart with a lot of information and you don't know what to do with it. When you design the metric, you say, when our organization, or when our, say, this program hits X number of attendees, we're going
Hmm.
to add more staff, or we're going to open
Hmm.
another site.
Hmm.
And you bake
Hmm.
that into the metric. So you're not deciding later on what's going to happen with that, but up
Sure.
front, here's what the metric is. And it's a decision point right away. And it's actionable when you see it.
Mm.
So there's a few thoughts, but I try to scale back what people are measuring so they get clear around, here's our real goal. Here are the handful of things, two, three, four, maybe at most, things that we know are moving the indicators. And then we have a handful of other things that are like decision metrics.
Yeah.
This metric, when that changes, we know we're making a decision point on this.
Gotcha. And I think you would agree with this, but my response to that is always, it's different by organization.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need to be really cautious um to try to develop these, you know, um core KPIs that we want every nonprofit
Mm-hmm.
organization, regardless of what their mission is, regardless of how they operate, regardless of, all of these variables that make it an
Yeah.
individual plan. The
Yeah.
organization really needs to do some soul searching and figure out what matters most to them, and
Mhm.
then kind of curate a list of KPIs or measurements that make sense to them. And people always say, what should our like financial metrics be, or what should our KPIs be? It's like,
Mm.
I'm going to put that back on you. I don't know if
Yeah.
I can give you a full list of this is what you should be tracking, and to
Yeah.
make that comparable across the whole sector. I just don't think that's possible.
Yeah, because a metric that might work great for one organization is actually going to have maybe some skewed or toxic incentives when it shows up in your organization, based on your culture, based on how the operation of the
Hmm.
programs are designed. And so adopting a metric from another organization won't always work for you for all the reasons that you listed, Tasha.
Yeah.
And there's also an extent to where uh, each of these metrics are designed for the progress trackers that you have need
Hmm.
to make sense based on the stage of organization you're in. So many people are going to
Mm.
be some are in growth mode and have a lot of funding, and that looks dramatically different. Some are
Yeah.
in much more of a stable place, and that looks a lot different. Some people are looking for grants and really trying to infuse different sorts of capital into or funding into the organization. And so that what you're
Hmm.
tracking and what you're displaying to funders is a lot different. So yeah,
Yeah.
you're right. It really is a variety. It is some soul searching. When people ask me for the metrics they need, I say we're going to do some workshops around that to
Yeah.
uncover kind of the heartbeat of what's happening in the organization and how the culture is defined around it,
Yeah.
and instead of giving you a package of here's your standard metrics.
Absolutely. It has to be custom. So I loved your example that you just gave about the bus and deploying the number of buses. I'm curious, do you have other tips or case studies or examples of how organizations have been able to use data to make better or more informed decisions, and maybe how that's changed? Because I'll be honest, a lot of times I think about data, programmatic outcomes, because that's what the funders
Sure,
require.
sure.
Data potentially to enhance our storytelling, to make a more compelling, message for purposes
Hmm.
of like fundraising or additional support in that way.
Hmm.
And then, of course, the accountant in me, I think of like data and track of like measuring dollars and cents to make sure
Hmm.
that we're not going off the rails from a
Yeah.
financial perspective. I'm sure, I mean, like you had just shared, creating data and tracking around, something like a bus deployment for a
Hmm.
transportation heavy program. What are some other ways that you're seeing organizations use data throughout kind of maybe their operation side, or in some other ways I haven't even considered?
Sure. You gave a lot of different examples in there. I'll give two ideas or two examples that what I've seen, and one will be close to your heart, Tasha.
Yeah.
I worked with a team of accountants and CPA. Like it was like the CFO and her team, and it came around to a lot of end of month and a lot of manual reporting, a
Hmm.
lot of exporting data from this system, exporting from this,
Yeah.
playing, doing lots of Excel magic. And there was some uh, introducing some relatively simple tools, something like a Power BI, some automation scripts in the background, and we're able to like take their scale of end of month operations and reporting that was required and whittle off like hours and hours of it from
Mm.
her team's work, or a little bit of maturity around some tools. This team was all very, very capable, very smart. They were very skilled in Excel, but I just showed them a different tool. Hey, let's do this in
Hmm.
Power BI or pick Tableau or whatever kind of like reporting tool you might want to use.
Hmm.
And once they got a little bit of training out, they're like, oh, this is going to save me hours.
Right. Right.
So that was a big win and really fun for them. Relatively easy for me to do. Like, hey, I think you guys just haven't seen this yet, and you could really benefit
Hmm.
from it.
Hmm.
Um, Another example that was I worked with a child safety organization, and one of the first things I talked about was with the executive director, got in there and trying to understand like what are the challenges they're currently facing.
Hmm.
And one of the things that was important for their program was visiting children that were placed in different homes, and like their staff checking in, assessing the current state of the child and how things going in their current placement.
Sure.
And currently they were collecting that information, but it was not visible in terms of being able to report on it effectively. And so
Hmm.
the executive director is just sitting there. He feels so passionate about this. It's one reason I love the nonprofit world, is because like people are in this world because they care about what's happening. And
Right.
he's passionate and a little bit frustrated. He's like, I don't know how many of our kids are safe right now because I don't have good
Mm.
metrics on how many we visited in the last month. I
Hmm.
can sort of get like a rough approximation from different things, but I need better information about what's happening.
Yeah.
And so it was a larger product. It's a large organization. But over the course of a couple of months, we were able to pull the data together in a different way, model it effectively, and then present them to say, here's what % of kids were visited on schedule and the reported statuses were effective. And the executive director got to the first kind of demo meeting we had with this and was like, breathe a sigh of relief. He's like, this is exactly what we need to, this is the type of North Star metric that nonprofit has, like, hey, ensuring children are safe that are in our care. And not a financial or profit or a revenue. Like, this was about children are safe. And so we're driving our data design and modeling around one of these key gaps, one of these key, like, just blind spots that they had. Like, we just don't know. It's an important part of our program, but right now we just can't see well. So data gives you that kind of visibility. And you mentioned like biases earlier, or kind of the idea of like, I have a gut feeling that this might be true. And this is where data gets a chance to remove that bias of, I think we're doing well. I think we're visiting kids on time. I think we're effective at our work. But once data can get involved, we can say, yes, you actually are being effective, or no, there are some gaps in your operations and your processes. But you don't know that until you get visibility.
Well, and that's a conversation I've been having for at least a decade now, when measurement and data became a bigger and bigger point of conversation in the nonprofit sector. Data is great until you start getting some answers that maybe are hard to face, and you have to have some honest conversations about how we can improve, right? And the more that you measure and collect, which I think is a good thing, hard, but good, to continue challenging us on how do we continue to enhance our programs. I'm curious though, Sawyer, let's just go with a scenario that an organization is, or I guess maybe give me like a typical case for you. Okay, so you're collecting data. I'm just thinking about how this transforms. I mean, everybody's listening like, oh my gosh, I wish my organization was here. Let's say they're here. Maybe describe a little bit of a typical organization. Everyone wants to know, am I typical? Is this normal? Everybody always asking that question. So maybe kind of describe like a typical organization that calls you like, hey, this is, maybe you kind of already have, but I guess I'm wondering, like, where are they at in the data collection? What tools are they using to collect? Where are you pulling this information from? Or like when you start working with an organization, where's the source of this information coming from? And then like, what needs to be true in terms of systems, processes, training of people in order to get to the more mature stage? Like maybe kind of walk through a little bit about what that transformation looks like and what an organization needs to do to make data a real thing, or maybe they have the data. How does it matter?
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me try to chart that. So it's a great question because it looks a little different based on the size of the organization. So I'm going to try to chart this across way it would look in a small, medium, or large organization.
Okay.
So in a small organization, you're primarily going to have data in a single place, right? And it's going to be like, and the way you can know that's like, hey, everything lives in our kind of CRM, and that's also our financial, and that's also kind of our employee management, or maybe it's their volunteer management. Maybe the data pretty much lives in one place, and you can do all of your reporting in there. That's why smaller organizations operate, and they don't have anybody on their staff who's focused on data or focused on IT. Maybe that's even outsourced.
Right.
And so in that size organization, what data maturity looks like is being aware of the data you have. And right now, it's probably like, hey, it all lives in one system. Everybody uses the same system. Data lives in one place. That's great. The next step is going to be, what does it look like to give data a seat at the table? So when making decisions and exploring the next steps, how do you give data a voice? And this is the fastest way for you to realize what data you have and what data you wish you had. So if you start to realize, okay, we have these data, it's our main operational system right now. Now, when we have decisions, we're going to start bringing it to the table and start asking, what data do we have? And then all of a sudden we'll start to figure out the gaps. Like, oh, we have no idea about X, Y, and Z. I wish we knew that. That would help our decision-making a lot here.
Right.
So there's what it looks like in small organizations. Leverage your existing tools, right? So you've got some basic reporting, probably some basic visualization that's already within those tools. Start to take intentional care about like, hey, we're going to design a basic dashboard. We're going to design some core operational metrics for us and just get some visibility about data. That's maybe like core basic starting point. And then as you get more mature, you maybe start to introduce a business intelligence tool that allow you to customize things differently. So a business intelligence tool two big ones in the market, something like Power BI or Tableau. There are others, but it allows you to customize metrics, customize data, add an Excel sheet in here, an Excel sheet here as our CRM data, and then start to look at that all in one place. And so that's the next level of sophistication. And that's where you start having somebody on your team that's maybe part-time on data, part-time building reports, maybe a full-time person who's like a data analyst. The larger organization, so once you step up to kind of medium or large size organizations, they're going to start having a couple of people who are dedicated to IT and or data work. And this is where you start introducing databases or data warehouses. This is where you've got maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 different main systems that the organization operates on. And now my accounting system, my CRM system, maybe my inventory system for staff, I need to get that data into one place. And so that's where we start pulling data from all these systems and we load it to like kind of a main central source of truth data warehouse system.
Okay.
That requires some data expertise. You need people who build those connectors, move the data, keep it in sync, all that kind of thing. And then you have a centralized place to report. And I can see my financial data next to my donor data, or based on my volunteer data next to my inventory data. All those types of things can show up into one place, even though they're in different systems.
Gotcha.
So that's and it just continues in the complexity in terms of like the amount of technical infrastructure and the amount of people you have dedicated to the work. There are nonprofits that have, you've got a dozen people dedicated to just data and data science and data analytics.
Interesting. Well, that's certainly an evolution but I could see how absolutely powerful that would be for organizations. And I'm sure, the national major nonprofit organizations, to your point, has teams that, does this sort of work. So that's fascinating. That's interesting.
And I know majority of
makes me kind of want to have a data analyst team on my team, right?
Right. Most nonprofits aren't there, which is why I started and described primarily like the smaller size, because most people are at.
Exactly.
But the large organizations are like, hey, they've got a team of data people and they've got sophisticated data infrastructure and databases, warehouses, and reporting and analytics and generative AI and these different tools that are showing up, and they're figuring out how to adopt those. Harder and different to do that at smaller organizations.
Well, and that brings me kind of to my last point of why I was so interested in talking with you and kind of introducing the work that you do, because I think that organizations know the power of data, or at least can understand why data would be powerful for their operations, with some of the examples I gave earlier, whether it's program outcome measurement, telling a better story or more compelling story for purposes of fundraising, or just tracking kind of their financial stuff. And that all makes sense. But I think, at least for me, when I work for a nonprofit organization, we had tons of data, but I think everyone was completely overwhelmed and had no idea how to even get started with making sense of all this data. And I know that I work with other organizations that are in that same camp. And I know that people that are going to be listening are going to be having conversations or thinking about how can we make sense for this for our organization. But I'm curious to hear a little bit more about your work and how nonprofits might be able to reach out to you, because I don't know if it really dawned on me that there are people that do the kind of work that you do. And I say this because I've met people that do data as it relates to programmatic data and creating programmatic outcomes, right, for grassroots organizations and developing tools to measure it. But I've not yet met someone that is interested in looking at an enterprise level and all of the different sources of data, because a lot of times they are intertwined, or they should be intertwined, right? And I'm curious to hear a little bit more about like the work you do, and especially how nonprofit organizations can connect with you and how you work with these organizations. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So one of the things I talk about at the Data Shop, which is my organization, and I'm just a solo data consultant. I don't have a huge company; it's just me. But I'm really passionate about this work, and their mission is too important to ignore data and to waste their data. And so I'm passionate about helping them use data, start to leverage data to change their world, change their communities. Like their mission matters enough that we shouldn't be wasting data. So the way I partner with organizations it is some of the things we've talked about, like talking about measurement and defining what matters and the incentives that'll come along with that, and how do we find the right data and actually to measure that well at an organizational level. Organizations have that main outcome that they want to get, their main North Star. The way they get that is by making better decisions. Like the way you get your outcome is through consistently, reliably making thoughtful, informed decisions, and data is an important part of that. And so I help to connect those dots down, say, hey, here's our North Star. Here are the types of decisions we're facing. Here's the type of data we want to collect. Here's how we want to visualize and manage that. there's also a lot of technical work that comes alongside that too. Hey, maybe there is a database that we need to stand up. Maybe there is some nerdy like we start modeling data, we start designing analytical platforms or applications. There's those type of things that could come into play, really based on the size and scope, kind of like we've talked about of the organization.
Sure.
But oftentimes introducing some more scalable or performant business intelligence tools or reporting tools can just, I love watching the light bulbs come on when someone's like, oh, I didn't know we could do this.
Right.
And so I do training around like Power BI and help nonprofits get up to speed. Like, hey, we're gonna go from 0 to capable and building reports in Power BI over the course of a few days. So yeah, that's a little bit of the scope. I also write a daily email about data, leadership, and kind of nonprofit world and technology. And so
daily, impressive.
5 days a week, Monday through Friday, I write an email. I've been doing that for a little over a year, and it's my way of trying to give away as much information and much knowledge as I can. I want expertise to go out from me and not stay with me. And so you can find that on my website, thedatashop.co/daily. If that sounds interesting, short 2-minute blurbs where I write about these sorts of conversations and data and how I'm seeing it show up in the organizations that I work with. And I think it helps people. So that's
I love that. So tell us your website again, so that people that are listening, is that the best way to connect with you, or is social media, or what do you prefer?
Yeah, it is. So my website is thedatashop.co.
Okay.
So that's a great place to figure out what I'm up to. I have a podcast that's relatively new about nonprofit data. I have that daily email, and then LinkedIn is where I'm most active from a social media perspective. So you can find Sawyer Nyquist on LinkedIn. I think I'm the only one out there. I'll probably be the first one you'll find. And there I also post about data and interact with these types of conversations, how we measure outcomes and success in nonprofit organizations.
I love it. Well, it's been such a pleasure to have this conversation. I found it super fascinating. I know our listeners will too. So Sawyer, thank you again for coming on and entertaining us with all this data talk.
Thank you so much, Tasha. It was a pleasure.
Cool. And everyone listening, I do this every episode, but I know you found this information useful. So you know what to do. Engage with it in some way, share it, like it, subscribe, whatever you need to do. It just allows more nonprofit leaders to find content like this and hopefully make their organizations operate just a little bit easier for you and your team. Thank you all so much for listening. We'll see you next time. That's all we have for you today. Once again, I'm Tasha Anderson with the Charity CFO, and this is a Modern Nonprofit Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to A Modern Nonprofit Podcast on all major streaming platforms so you will stay notified for when the latest episode drops, which will help you stay in the know about anything nonprofit related. Also, join our community on Facebook by searching for A Modern Nonprofit Podcast and follow us on all of our social media accounts. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.